Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Manas, for joining us. I think you can do a better introduction of yourself than I ever could. So, first question of the evening, please just briefly introduce yourself, what you do, what London Politica is all about, and yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's firstly, thank you for having me, and it's a wonderful room and space to be in, and it's really cool that, I was just telling Dimitri that usually when I speak to in places like these, it's always politics and IR students. It's really cool that we have like a real variety across disciplines and ages. To tell you my story really briefly, and I don't want to ramble on too long. I started studying international relations at the LSE. Kind of when I was in high school, caught the MUN bug, if anyone else had that here. It's a really embarrassing bug to catch because it sort of becomes your whole personality. And I did that for too many years, knew I wanted to study IR, and the plan was very simple. I would, get into a good program for that. I'd become a diplomat. I'd do that for 30 years. I'd finish as Secretary General of the United Nations, and that was my life paved out at 16. And getting into uni, things didn't really go according to plan. I got into uni, I was sort of really, looking back now, probably a little bit naive and very aspirational, and realized how the UN actually worked and got super disillusioned very quickly. And it was around that time that there was a little student society at LSE called the Political Risk Society, and it had 6 active members. And so I said, it can't be that hard to be president of the society. Yeah. And so I walked in on the election day and had 4 people vote for me against 3. Yeah. And it was a very random start into getting into this world of political risk. The first person I met in the industry that did, geopolitical risk, described it as a simple industry where you get paid for having an opinion on world affairs. And that, 17-year-old Manas sounded fantastic, and is exactly what I wanted to do. The way, when I sort of learned more about it, I realized there were 2 huge problems kind of in my industry that I wanted to solve. One problem was that the firms that were giving advice were extremely consolidated in who the client base was. So you had firms like Eurasia Group, like Oxford Analytica, like the Economist Intelligence Unit, right? All their clients effectively were large financial institutions or large, Fortune 500 companies. And my thesis was that the people that need geopolitical advice is much larger than that, right? The small to medium-sized businesses, humanitarian aid groups, international organizations, charitable ventures, right? The people that really need political risk were entirely priced out of the industry because they can't pay, 200 grand, 300 grand a year for a glorified, subscription service. And that was one of the problems I wanted to solve. Second thing I saw was there was a huge gap between, all the IR students that I went into uni with who started just like me, wanting to be a diplomat, work for the UN, and then who 6 months later, especially at LSE, decided they wanted to be consultants and investment bankers and corporate lawyers. And it seemed like there was this industry that very few people knew about, but would be a perfect fit for. And there's a huge sort of gap kind of in the recruiting and the job market. And to bridge both of those gaps, I started London Politica, which I've been leading for the last 5.5 years now. And it was initially meant to be a geopolitical risk advisory for social impact. And the idea was to do political risk advice for exactly the kind of organizations that were crowded out that I spoke about. We worked for the Red Cross, the World Food Program, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum. And we did that by engaging young professionals, sometimes students, sometimes undergrads even, who were just really knowledgeable in a particular area of the world, right? They were studying sub-Saharan Africa, they're writing their dissertations on, Southeast Asian politics, and we figured that if we could bring them together on projects, we could solve interesting problems that had a real-world impact. And doing that for 2 or 3 years, we built up a network, and then the first person came to me and said, well, how much do you charge? And at the time, everything was pro bono, right? Everything we did was for social impact. But I realized that I built up something that I could then scale and to make a more commercial model out of it. And that's what we did. And so for the last couple of years, we are primarily a commercial political risk advisory, and I can talk more about what we do and how we got there. But we also do some pro bono projects every now and then, and we operate in a very different way to other players in our space. one other thing I do, while doing a lot of this, we started consulting governments, and consulting foreign ministries initially was a really daunting thing because you're speaking to a diplomat who has 20 years of experience. The more I got into it, the more I realized how big the disparity is, between diplomatic training. So in places like the UK, you've had a diplomatic academy around for over 300 years in some way, shape, or form, right? In a country like the UAE, it's been around for about 7 years. And so there's a lot of countries that are, really punching above their weight in diplomacy that have no institutional statecraft or mechanism to actually effectively teach their diplomats. And I wanted to solve that problem. And, I went to literally my first year university professor, whose body of work was international symmetry and diplomacy. That's what he would study academically, Tristan Naylor. And he actually, until recently, was at Cambridge. He was first at LSE, then at Oxford, and then at Cambridge. And I said, well, we should build a diplomatic academy from the ground up and make it something truly disruptive and something that can help those countries that need to, invest in their diplomacy, but also bridge the gap between, traditional state diplomacy as well as sort of corporate diplomacy, right? One of my huge points of thesis is that it's not just countries that do diplomacy anymore. Companies are often as involved with that, if not more. My master's dissertation was basically arguing that Microsoft was the world's first full-fledged corporate foreign ministry. Right? They had 150 former senior EU diplomats appointed. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, makes more speeches at the UN General Assembly than most heads of state do. And so I'm just sprinkling in a couple of topics that maybe we can pick up on later. And so we ran the first version of the Oxbridge Diplomatic Academy in Cambridge. We ran it at Trinity Hall this summer. We actually launched it in King's, and we're doing the next one in Oxford. And so it's grown from, it was just a small, tight course of 20 people this year, and I think we kind of excelled in, trying to do something very specific, which is not do general diplomacy training, but deliver the highest end master classes for very mid-career and senior people. And so we had, 4 or 5 former foreign ministers fly in to do just like a 2-hour masterclass. We had the former Prime Minister of Iceland open the debate. And, all of these people, I didn't know them about a year before this. And so we really started this from the ground up. And that was a process of a lot of learning. And so, those are 2 things I do. And the last thing I do, just purely as an intellectual undertaking, I took up a PhD at LSE. And I'm researching, the kind of confluence of geopolitics and big tech actors. Right? Basically, how do we get these big tech companies to become so powerful? How do they compare to previous generations of very powerful companies like big oil, big finance? And how do they use this political power and legitimize themselves? And where is this going? And how does AI figure into all of this? So I think in a nutshell, those are the 3 things I do, how I got there. Yeah.
Awesome. Just listening to you talk about it, it sounds like the work is incredibly fulfilling and fun. But I imagine it's also hard. You face obstacles. It's quite stressful at times. What sort of keeps you going in those moments when maybe it's not such a good day, you have some problems at work? What's sort of the big motivator and like the big picture of like what's the whole why?
Yeah. I guess the really lucky thing is that by the nature of my job, usually the people that I'm working with have a much larger problem than I do, that we're trying to help them solve, which makes the job a little bit easier, right? And I think the second thing is, I think constantly, realizing, constantly being in awe of a particular institution or in-group, right? Whether when I started the academy, it was this sort of like secret cabal of diplomats that ruled the world that I wanted to break into and understand, how those networks function. The more and more I got into these groups and like had a so-called seat at the table, even briefly, you kind of realize that it's not all that, a lot of the aura of it is made up in your head. And a lot of these things are so much more approachable and accessible than you initially think. And I think a part of, what I do is really try to deconstruct, spaces and communities like those. And which is why I love doing events like these.
I want to get into sort of London Politica mainly, but just before I do that, to set it up, let's talk about like the industry within which it operates. So I guess my first question would be, what are some common misconceptions or like stereotypes that people have about the industry when talking about the people that do have some understanding about what geopolitical risk consultancy is. Like what are some misconceptions and how is it different in reality?
I think people have this conception of political intelligence, political risk as like there's two archetypes or stereotypes. One is that if you get into this, you're kind of a corporate bond-like actor traveling around the world, meeting interesting secretive people and like supplying that intelligence to companies and essentially a corporate spy. And there was some truth to that maybe 25 years ago in one or two companies, but like not anymore, right? This industry has become a lot more democratized, I think for good reason, and a lot more accessible and open and regulated and transparent than like that picture is the case, right? But there's still some companies that have this perception of they're started by former spooks and MI6 and CIA people, but none of that actually translates into the day-to-day work at all. And I think the second kind of stereotype people have is, well, maybe these are just incredibly intellectual academic people that have years and years and years and decades of research that they use to advise corporate or public actors. And in reality, 90% of the work that you do, you will encounter. It'll be such a specific problem, which is why they're coming to you with it, that you've never encountered before. And there's no handbook on it, and there's no expert that you can call, and you kind of just have to figure it out, right? Which is also kind of the nature of it that keeps it really dynamic and interesting. And probably a third misconception is people think, you get paid a lot, which you don't.
We won't tell anybody about the spying, don't worry.
Yeah.
How has the industry changed over time? Because it seems like even you yourself in London Politica has been a part of a change, at least in the side of sort of who can enter the industry and how people enter the industry. I think in one of the podcasts you talked about how mostly people used to just sort of come over from being a diplomat from other industries, whereas it feels like you're sort of enabling people to go in straight after uni.
I mean, I like to think of like, I mean, show of hands, is anyone interested in entering the political risk industry potentially one day? A couple of people? Okay. I'm trying to tailor this where I can. The industry evolved as a result of what need it was catering to, right? So it grew in the 60s, 70s, 80s because there were parts of the world that effectively no corporation had been to, that you wanted to mine in or you wanted to extract oil in parts of the Middle East and parts of Africa. You then needed an industry to advise you about those places, but primarily to insure you in risk in those places. And I mean, we're talking like the risk of ransom, the risk of terrorism, the risk of kidnapping of your corporate executives. And so an insurance industry started to cater to that. And then to insure it and put a price on it, you have to understand it and do some research around it. And that's how the industry started, right? Some of the oldest firms in it are actually security consultants. So like, just as an example, like one of the biggest players in political risk is G4S. And G4S does like primarily physical security, boots on the ground. So everything from like the nightclub bouncers to Cambridge are G4S employees. You'll see that logo on their shirt. But also if you're the CEO of Coca-Cola and you need to go to Mali for a meeting, and you need to have armed men with you, taking you in a motorcade, that's what G4S does, right? And so it moved from kind of an extractive industry to a security-based industry to something that largely, financial institutions and banks used over the last 20 years or so. And now my big argument is that it's becoming primarily answering to big tech. The big tech companies are furthest in their use of these companies, but more importantly, they're actually weaning themselves off of it because their in-house offerings and capabilities are so much stronger, right? So like the more commonly known examples is Nick Clegg, for instance, becoming, head of global affairs at Meta, right? But even at the kind of lesser, sort of more managerial level, like talking about firms like Microsoft, it has an entire United Nations Affairs Division and an office at the UN that competes with nation states, right? Which I find really fascinating. Or it pens treaties like the Digital Geneva Convention that you may or may not have heard of, was something the U.S. failed to pass. Microsoft brought country actors together, and so in a way I think like big tech is the next evolution of political risk, and that's probably how it's changed. I think from the kind of employment or sort of recruitment side. I think 20 years ago was an industry you necessarily transitioned from a vast career in civil service and academia and law. Probably around 8 years ago, it started changing, and like I think what we were trying to do was push for a lot of that, is to make it an industry where there's more regulated, grad schemes and summer internships and more transparent hiring. And so over the last few years, a lot of the people that worked with us pro bono initially, probably at least 60, 70 of them, we got them placed in the political risk firms that they are in today.
Are you offering internships currently?
I mean, not right now. Maybe in the summer we might. Yeah. We do constantly
asking
recruit
for the people.
Sure.
Okay, so moving on to the company, and sort of, I think the part that I'm most interested in, and I think a lot of people here as well, is sort of the beginning and how it all came to be, especially sort of with alongside studies, because that's something you don't see very, very often, I guess. So what was like what was the day-to-day of it like how did you convince people to sort of get on board with it? How did you, at what point did you go and register a company, and how did you find your first client?
Yeah. It was really scrappy. We started the company, and I put out applications on LinkedIn, and I never hired someone. I'd never gotten hired before, let alone hire someone. And I think there was such a massive gap in the space, basically so many smart politics IR students and such little jobs, that in a week we had 500 applications. And that was it. And we had no work record, we had no track record. We had a website that I built from scratch in a day. And I was then spending 3 weeks, morning, day and night, interviewing 100 people out of those 500. And so that was a really, if imposter syndrome was squeezed into a couple of weeks, that was that for me. And once we had a team established, we needed to actually do work. And I thought that if we were starting to offer these services for free and we were going to social impact, surely we'd have people knocking on our door. And that did not happen. The first 3 weeks we had no work. And so we started off really, really scrappily. Our first client was literally someone who worked with us. His mom was on the board of a charity in Vietnam that became our first client, right? And then that grew into something, and then we got a referral, and that grew into something. And then once we had our first 5, we started, sending out 500 cold emails a week to the UN, the Red Cross, the World Food Program. One of the things we realized is these organizations are so dispersed and so global that we'd get 5 no's from 5 different offices, but 1 yes from one office that might need the service. And so you'd have to constantly keep trying and trying and trying. But I think the most crucial thing I learned from doing all of that is the importance of doing things that don't scale. I think too many people are too invested in being an entrepreneur and starting a business that they want a plan at the very start that can scale to $1 million in revenue, or your first 100,000 users if it's a tech company, or whatever it is, right? And if you look at, I think, the case studies of the most interesting, most successful companies out of Silicon Valley, and there's a really interesting essay that Paul Graham wrote about this, the guy who started Y Combinator in 2013, and it's one of the essays that changed my thinking the most. It's about the importance of doing things that don't scale, right? As a quick example, Brian Chesky, when he started at Airbnb, wanted to sell houses and connect, supply and demand between people who had spare bedrooms and people who needed spare bedrooms. But how do you start that? It's a market problem. It's a first mover problem, right? So they literally went to New York, went to coffee shops, asked people, do you have a spare room? Can we go and take a picture of it? And can we put it on the internet for someone to live in? Right? Today, nobody would do that, right? That would be nobody's go-to-market strategy, right? But they were scrappy at first. They did that, and then they scaled. Has anyone seen Fireflies.ai? It's the digital note taker. You're in a Zoom meeting, right? Yeah. When Firefly started, I think this was this week, this article came out talking about it's like an AI note taker basically in Zoom meetings. When they started, they had no product, but they put up a landing page. They said they had a product, and then the founder would mute his mic, turn off his camera, enter the meeting as Fireflies, listen to the meeting, take manual notes, did that 100 times to only figure out if there was an actual market product fit, right? And once there was, then they invested into the tech. And what I see that's quite interesting is that entire dynamic has changed because we're in a money in a like a temporary period of cheap capital, right? Like the VCs are writing checks like anything. You put AI at the end of a company name, it's very easy to raise around in Silicon Valley. And so I think a lot of that hustle and grit has gone away, but after there's a market correction, after the AI bubble pops, I think entrepreneurship will go back to that very nitty-gritty start, something that scales out of it. And there's so many other, interesting examples like that.
In the past 5-6 years, what are some lessons you've learned sort of running the company, and sort of if you were to do it over again today, what would you do differently?
Yeah. And also, I mean, at any point, guys, like if anyone has any questions or a comment, jump in, yeah.
So, on the previous question, if I understand correctly, you started the company before having an initial client?
Yeah.
And then you put at the recruitment, do you consider that person as a co-founder, or was it actually with a contract of, I'm going to pay you and you're my first employee?
They were all contractors, yeah. So our first...
So directly, okay.
Yeah, so our first 50 people that we hired, and there's people that were like sort of vaguely in our network that would write research for us that we could then potentially pass off to clients. We're all contractors.
Okay.
And look, like I started this when I was 17, 18, like I had no idea people think really intensively now, like how picking their co-founder and being in spaces where they can find a co-founder. Like I was just starting a website out of my parents' garage, literally, right? To repeat your question again, you said some things that I learned. I think doing things that don't scale is one of them. I think being ready to pivot is another one. Like our ethos and mission pivoted so many different times. There's one point that the scale of the problem in the industry that we were trying to solve was so big that people went to us and said, you should become a recruitment firm. Become the first recruitment firm for geopolitical risk because you have a great network of young grads that you can place in other companies. And I tried to do that for 3 months and it didn't work out, right? Before we tried doing the Oxbridge Diplomatic Academy and we did it in Cambridge, it took 2 years to put that together. When I first started, we planned for it to be in 3 months. I was like, how hard could it be? You write some emails to some people, get them to lecture in Oxford, put out some applications, right? Completely naive, right? Not how it works. And I think too many people want like a concrete idea or like a 6-month plan or a 5-year plan. And I think all the most successful companies pivot insanely, right? Like another story I really like is Flickr, right? The kind of photo sharing site nobody uses anymore, but used when we were kids. Flickr started off as a video game, and they wanted to make like a really cool multiplayer video game that was catching on to the latest trends. It was built by 2 gamers, and they basically didn't know how to code, and so all they made was like the setting to upload your avatar, and they couldn't make any game after that. And then they pivoted and made a photo sharing site because they could upload an avatar really, really well. And if you can upload an avatar, you can upload any image, right? And that became Flickr. And so I think the importance of pivoting is sometimes underrated when everyone's trying to plan their 10th step, before they take their first one. What are other things I learned? I think I learned that the golden handcuffs people talk about in university when you're job hunting are like really concrete and real and tangible things. Like I said, when I went into uni, I began university with all these, political science nerds. 90% of them are investment bankers, consultants, and lawyers who hate themselves today, right? I mean, truly, like so many of them had aspirational goals about what to do, and not for any fault of their own, but primarily also because it's very hard to get jobs in the space, and it takes a lot of privilege to be in a space where you can apply for jobs that don't have as high a salary or mobility or XYZ, right? But they decided in first year that's not what they wanted to do, and they would do something else for 2 or 3 years, make a lot of money, pay off their debt, and then go back to helping the world and doing what they really want to do, et cetera, et cetera. And none of those people ended up actually ever doing that, right? For a variety of reasons, right? You get stuck into the status hierarchy that you're climbing, and everyone around you does that, and there's a lot of sort of self-rationalization of that. And I think the people who were a little bit naive, and I'd maybe include myself in that, but a few others who said, we're going to stick it out and see what this brings us. Many of us didn't succeed at first, but I think with 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 tries of doing something, you eventually get there.
Last question I want to ask on the company before we go on to talking about some current affairs. I gather you're not a big fan of like 5-10 year plans, but what is the general direction or vision that you have for London Politica? That sort of where would you see London Politica in the future? And also a second question: is it like, do you see the company as sort of your child that you want to cherish and hold on to forever, or would you ever consider selling it?
And the second question is easier. I wouldn't sell it because it's not a sellable company. Like certain companies have a product and an infrastructure and like something to sell, right? The only thing that we make money off of is our relationships, and they're so intricately tied to us that there's nothing we could give to anyone else. Which is why like M&A doesn't really happen in this industry, and when it does, it goes awfully.
Right.
And your first question was
Just
the vision for the
plans
future,
and
right?
visions, yeah.
I don't know. I think the biggest constraints on us are that like I am really not willing to do something that I find boring, which is usually bad for business, right? Most political risk companies start off wanting to do global macro politics for high level investors, and then realize there's actually specific use case doing, I don't know, like supply chain due diligence, and then scale that to the top 200 Fortune 500 companies, right? That's and then they kind of specialize in a region or an area or whatever. But I think I'm so tied to trying to do this at the most macro level possible, to answering the big questions for the people that actually matter, and not, cornering ourselves into a pigeonhole of we only do this for this specific segment, that we have to constantly reinvent our business model to keep up with that. One of the things that I find really interesting is companies that are consultancies, but more than consultancies. They're consultancies, they also do a lot of media, they're also conveners. And so like the dream would be in 10 years from now, if instead of being a client of LP and you purchase, a research report, you were part of the London Politica community, which is all the geopolitical people in these corporations around the world. And not only was it a forum to discuss some of these geopolitical issues, but to get bespoke advice, to actually bring people together, to be also like a public voice for doing a lot of this, right? I think a lot of the geopolitical thought leadership industry is really flawed because it's centered around basically 50 former ministers or ambassadors who found a career in the corporate life and are kind of riding off the coattails of something they did 10 years ago. And so there's all these mini spaces I want to disrupt kind of by bringing together into one model.
That's very visionary, I think, to sort of to connect the industry more, if I understood correctly, to sort of have this network of people and sort of have it be more collaborative, right? Rather than just sort of a bunch of companies on their own doing research and trying to consult people.
Like this was the initial idea behind like starting the World Economic Forum, right? It's like all these companies would come together in this, beautiful snowy mountaintop, and we're going to discuss global affairs and find solutions to problems. And like now it's just like in a really, really expensive talk shop and nothing more than that, right? And so I think, but the need for that is greater than ever, and I think that's kind of what we want to do. Another thing about, just to remind me about like doing things that don't scale and lucky accidents that start companies, when Klaus Schwab started the World Economic Forum, which like now everyone thinks of as the most successful global business forum, he chose Davos as a location. And today there's like a lot of conspiracy theories around it, and like why is it on this secret, hard to access kind of place. The reason he chose it, I think it was 1973, is because he had no confidence that anyone would come to this business investor summit. There's 100 people invited, and he said, there's a ski resort in Davos, and more than any place in Switzerland, that has a 15% discount that weekend. And so at least if people don't come for the conference, they'll come to ski, right? And it never changed. And that's why Davos is Davos today, right?
Very cool. I want to keep some time for questions from the audience as well, but just briefly before that, a bit of what you actually do for a living, which we are very privileged to sort of experience today. So I want to hear your opinions on a couple matters. Obviously, there's a lot of things going on currently in the world. I think you're sort of the opinion that now there's more turbulence geopolitically than there was some decades ago.
Sure.
So probably the first thing I want to ask, myself being Russian-born, obviously the sort of devastating war that is happening now between Russia and Ukraine has been going on for years now. Do you see it as a vanity project of Putin?
I mean, my girlfriend's Ukrainian, so I always get shy talking about Ukraine in front of her. But is it a vanity project of Putin?
Is it about ego?
I don't know if it's about I think sometimes people try to read his mind and make this like a very individualistic argument about like how Putin was and his visions of Russian grandeur, and like I'm sure there's something to that, but I also think that is like a overtly like kind of cherry-picked reading of what's happening. Like I think there's a little bit of that, but there's also Putin using this as a way to cement his position in a spider web of Russian politics where things are a lot more volatile and a lot less top-down than you can see on the surface, right? Like the fact that Prigozhin one day, the head of Wagner Group, or the private military company, go up in arms and say we're going to march on Moscow and unseat Putin from power. The fact that it happened came as a surprise to lots of people, but those that have been watching Russia for decades knew that something like that would never materialize so publicly, but has been happening behind the scenes, every single day, right? And one of the best ways to prevent, for most modern dictators, or to cement their position in power, is to start something of a diversionary war, which if you ask yourself, like, what does Vladimir Putin have to gain in, bombed out areas of largely rural land that have ethnic populations that'll never fully integrate or want to integrate with this country? Like, part of it is about vanity, part of it is about cementing his position, part of it is about changing the status quo of the international order, right? When you're at a moment when the US is no longer reliably the global hegemon, and for better or worse, is no longer the world police, an action like that is like era defining in terms of what the rules are for the next international order, right? So what happens in Ukraine has ramifications not just for Ukraine, but for what happens in Taiwan, what happens in all the other ethnic areas of Russia that are ready to revolt at moment's notice, like Dagestan or Chechnya or others, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I'd say there's lots of factors around it. What do you think? I mean, you're Russian born.
I think it's very complicated.
I agree.
Two other major powers, U.S. and China.
Yeah.
There's obviously tension there, a lot, partly to do with like the semiconductors and everything, but not just. How do you see that developing, working out, and what does it mean that during this time of tension, Donald Trump is the president? How does that influence the relationship?
So the last time I was in Cambridge, I was moderating a talk with Graham Allison, who famously wrote the Thucydides Trap and this thing about when a resurgent power goes to head-to-head with an established power, 12 out of 16 times it results in war, looking as far back as the Peloponnesian Wars. It was called the Thucydides Trap, right? And so he's probably the most in vogue scholar of U.S.-China relations. And there's one thing he said that I'd never thought of, and I think nobody talks about, but it's completely true, which is there is extreme bipartisan hawkishness on China in the United States. So if you're a Democrat or Republican, you can kind of toe the same line on China, which is that it's a massive, strategic competitor, is our biggest geopolitical rival, is the new Cold War, blah, blah, blah. Donald Trump, if you had to rank him on a list of people in D.C. on how hawkish they are on China, would be dead last on that list, right? There's something really interesting about the fact that he, I think, has no genuine in anything that he's ever said or the policy he's pursued towards it. I mean, A, isn't substantially that different from Biden's, but also B, he openly admires Xi Jinping, and I think likes, the fact that Xi Jinping, is a moniker of a world that is divided into spheres of influence, right? When Xi Jinping can do what he does in Xinjiang, I think Trump looks at him not in defiance, but with a sense of admiration of why can't I do this in parts of the world that I consider my sphere of influence, right? Like, he's got a system of politics that set him up for, as ruler for life, right? And so that's an interesting dynamic of the mainstream DC political apparatus and everything they think, And some of them are very, very hawkish, right? The people who actually pull the strings in DC, and there's only 5 or 6 of them in the general State Department national security bubble. And many of them want to take away all the resources from the war in Ukraine and prepare for a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And then on that last point of Taiwan and China, I think too often it's really sexy to look at this as a potential binary configuration of will they not invade, and becomes kind of a D-Day movie-like scenario that people can throw the puck about, because eventually if it does or doesn't happen, nobody remembers what these thought leaders said, right? I think fundamentally what will or is most likely to happen is not a all-out amphibious invasion, right? Which for many reasons would be catastrophic, of course, to Taiwan, but also to China, right? I mean, China is going through a time where it has 25% youth unemployment, with 130% debt to GDP ratio, right? It's a property market that's collapsed. The rest of the world is still struggling with inflation. The UK is, after yesterday's budget. China's struggling with deflation. The demographic picture in China is much worse than it is for the Europe or Japan or anywhere else in the world, right? So there's all these reasons why starting a war is probably not a good idea for Xi Jinping right now. So, well, what will he do? And I think what he will do is the kind of frog in boiling water strategy, right? Of you test the limits, gradually encroached one by one. You have freedom of navigation operations that become more and more common, right? Which is basically when your ships go in a part of the sea that it's either disputed or national territory or whatever, to assert that you can in fact go in that water as a sovereign actor. Cyber operations, right? They'll wait probably for a time when there's a more conducive government in Taipei to influence things domestically. And so you have all these sub-threshold things that I think China is much more likely to do that, in 20 years' time, if they do successfully, with the West turning a blind eye towards it and accepting endless swaths of BRI investment like parts of Europe are right now, like Hungary, like Italy is, will, in 20 years' time, the China-Taiwan relationship will look completely different to what it is today.
There's lots of questions I'd love to ask you, but just because of time, the last one I'll ask before I'll open it to the audience. We touched briefly on AI. What is your thought on AI as a whole? Is it a bubble? And then secondly, how will it influence the political arena, especially with sort of large companies becoming more and more dominant and sort of becoming these major players?
Yeah. Oh God, where to start? Okay, there's a micro level of looking at this, is a macro level, right? So the micro level is, does AI work, right? Does all the predictions about, we're going to use AI, it's going to supercharge our industries and make us a lot more efficient and displace millions of people, is that going to happen, and how soon will that happen? What does that mean? I think the most instructive thing I've read on that is in August, MIT published a study, the famous MIT AI study, that said that 95% of companies, and they did a meta study where they looked at 300 companies that try to use AI in their own company. So 95% of these companies saw absolutely no financial return from using AI in their processes, right? 5% did. And it was basically something to do with the ones that failed were the ones that had an incentive structure where every C-suite corporate manager was like, we need AI, AI, AI. It's a hot new buzzword. And so people were simply bolting on a very, very general purpose application into a very, very specific process that led to basically more work than less work. When that study came out, NVIDIA lost $4 billion of its market cap, exclusively because of this, right, on the same day. Right? That tells you two things, right? It tells you about A, the study was really rigorous and good and probably had some truth to it, but B, that NVIDIA and companies like it in kind of the AI bubble are built on a much more precarious value proposition than most companies that we know about. The second point is, on a macro level, is it a bubble? How does it compare to previous bubbles? If you look at any economic indicator, the financials are astounding, right? We've all heard by this point have you seen the circular chart of CoreWeave NVIDIA, TSMC, OpenAI, Microsoft, right? And they're basically passing around hundreds of billions of dollars amongst each other, right? It's like if I started a lemonade stand, I try to sell you lemonade, but you borrowed $1 from me to buy the lemonade, right? And that's basically where most of the AI industry is today, right? OpenAI, NVIDIA is often loaning money to OpenAI, investing in OpenAI for it to use NVIDIA chips and data centers, right? That's a twofold problem, right? It goes one of two ways, right? Either you use that initial debt to fall in love with my lemonade and you have more and more and more lemonade, and then there's a sustainable industry. Or you yourself go bust, in which case I've lost lemonade and I've lost $1, right? And so a lot of the expectations around the sustainability of the AI space are built around them delivering a financial return consistently that is above expectation every single quarter. And every single quarter, and we saw this in the last quarter, for 4 or 5 days, markets dipped every single day, right? We were waiting for these NVIDIA earnings coming out, and then they were good. And then everything went back to normal, right? But that is not a sign of a structural analysis of an industry. And then if you want a really kind of, theoretical level about how will we possibly, use AI in a way that is effective, I think the answer is genuinely about general purpose models and specific applications of those general purpose models being a lot harder than we typically think, right? A great example is you look back at another, AI is like the next industrial revolution, right? The first industrial revolution, I think what I read was there's a 63-year gap between them making the first mechanized factory assembly line and then the first ever factory. So they created the thought process of creating a factory. It took 63 years for the Ford Model T, which was the first factory, right, to ever be constructed. So why did they take 63 years, right? Because the answer was already out there. It took 63 years because you have to specialize it to a particular use case. You have to raise funding around it. You have to get product market validation. You have to do all of those things at scale, right? And more steps. And so those things can't be scaled in the same way that you can scale chips, right? Those are still real constraints that exist that slow down AI adoption and AI growth. And I think what will happen is all the hype right now is fueled around large language models that are getting insane amounts of funding, and they'll get more and more and more. And then eventually one of these actors will falter, and then some more will falter, and then investors will get, really, really pissed off, and households will. We have the highest exposure of household wealth to the stock market ever in history, ever, right? The only other time it was this high was during the dot-com bubble, right? I think like 27% of household wealth is now in American equities, and like 90% of the equity growth in American equities is like, 7 or 8 tech companies, pretty much, right? And I think what happens at the end of all of this is the bubble bursts, and has anyone seen the Gartner hype cycle? It's becoming really popular, right? It's basically something that goes like the average sort of product cycle of a new technology is it goes up and up and up and up and up. It reaches a saturation point when it's too oversubscribed, too overhyped, and the financials and the actual industrials aren't there. And then it falls down, and then it grows really, really, really slowly, but back to the same heights for a much longer period of time. I think we're at that height, or nearing that height right now. But once we fall, it means that people and investors will be much more strategic about their allocation of where money goes in AI, right? It won't be just all LLMs. A lot of it will be small language models, right, which are a lot more useful, a lot cheaper, a lot less energy intensive, and a lot more effective at doing those tasks. A lot of these investments into AI won't have anything to do with language models, right? The transformer architecture that Google created in 2017 and what language models are based off of is a very, very specific instantiation of AI. But you can also use AI to modulate the coils in a nuclear fusion reactor. And if you solve nuclear fusion, you can't even estimate, how the world changes in accordance to that. And we're pretty far from it right now, but are we 10 years away or 70 years away? Nobody knows. But if and when we get there, right, that changes the structure of the global economy, right? If you excessively use AI in healthcare in a way that actually delivers results, it's not based on predictive analytics, but based on a totally different architecture, right? That changes things. And so I think once the bubble pops, that's when the really interesting use cases of AI actually start to come forward. But that said, everybody has an opinion on AI nowadays, so take mine with a grain of salt. But also, if you have opinions on this, like, let me know, and I'm happy to have more of a discussion on it.
Awesome. On that note, if anybody has any questions, I think we have time for a couple.
I have a question, please. The AI bubble popping in the US versus in China, I imagine that are they two separate bubbles? What's that interaction going to be like?
It's a great question. I don't really know the answer. I'm not sure if anyone really knows the answer, because nobody really knows how much the usual model of Chinese investment into industry, which is either state-owned enterprises or state-built-out enterprises that have a lot of state subsidy, carving out a space for themselves. That's the usual model. Nobody really knows how much of that is in the AI space in China, right? So we know that like DeepSeek had some government involvement, but not a lot, right? We also know that DeepSeek, which was the Chinese model that did things a lot more efficiently than Western models, right? Said they did it off a certain amount of compute. And then we later realized it was actually a much larger amount of compute. It wasn't actually that impressive, right? So there's a lot more uncertainty around that. I think one thing that changes this dynamic is that I think the era of scaling is over, right? So what that means is up until roughly 2020, if you had an AI company and you were more profitable than another AI company, it was because you had better research. It was like the era of research, right? You just came up with newer and newer interesting applications. At some point in 2020, everyone kind of had the same research, the same transformer architecture. And the question was who can raise the most amount of money to buy the most amount of chips to train their models on the most amount of parameters? And if you just use the same fundamental technology, but just scale it, infinitely, right? Surely your models will keep getting better and better and better and better. And that was the case until I think this year, right? Until this year, you've reached a fundamental glass ceiling in what GPT-5 can do. And ChatGPT in particular is near and dear to me because I worked on GPT-4 because they recruited a red team, and so it was all about how can we red team these models against the worst use cases, right? So against misinformation, disinformation. So they said we need a geopolitical contributor to tell us how to, and so we would sit around and we would basically try to create disinformation on it, and the most manual way you could, right? You'd literally be I am a journalism student, write me a Russian propaganda piece or something. And it would, and sometimes it wouldn't. And where it would, you'd have to figure out physical intercepts to it. And so doing that process, you realize that a lot of this technology and the applications of it are peaking. And this is what, the former chief scientist of OpenAI said is this year the era of scaling is over. And now we go back to research. The reason that relates to US-China in this entire tangent is because China can't scale in the same way that the US can, right? Simply, nobody in China would write, the same $100 billion check with ease that you can in Silicon Valley. The environment just doesn't exist. And not in China, not in anywhere else in the world other than Silicon Valley. So far that gave Silicon Valley the advantage, but now that it's more about technological breakthrough and research and not just buying the sexiest, fastest, most expensive chips, that changes the balance a little bit, equalizes the playing field more.
More questions? Go ahead.
I have one brief thing. I'm sorry to take away from AI. Everyone loves AI. And
Sure.
It's not my area at all. I was wondering, you talked about briefly about kind of the shifting spheres of influence. The Americans are pulling out the Middle East with USA, focusing on their own area, China, Russia, in Eurasia and so on. I'm wondering, lots of your clients seem very London or American based. With this kind of diversification of the market for emerging regions. Central Asia is one that's especially interesting to me. Are you doing anything at London Politica to kind of, broaden your horizons outside of those to the kind of shifting market demand in these different places?
Yeah, we want to. I personally want to because I find these regions of the world much more interesting than where usually political risk has existed and where client demand is. There's two problems, right? One is that actual political risk is coming back home in the sense that 20 years ago, people wanted to know what's happening in Sudan and Mali and Mexico and India. And today people want to know where will Nigel Farage's polling be next year, right? And that's the number one question we're answering. And so that's to say that a lot of it is in the Western developed world, as there's less client intake in the first place. The second thing is a huge culture difference, right? You can sell political risk to an American company because primarily the person that buys political risk advice, on the surface, maybe on paper, is doing it because they want their company to be more agile in navigating geopolitics, blah, blah, blah. Realistically, 9 out of 10 times, it is a corporate executive that wants to look smarter to their board and their C-suite than any other corporate executive. Like, that is completely why most people buy the service, and then they get hooked on for its actual practical benefits. In my experience, that's just impossible to do in India and China. Like, we've tried to sell in India and China. Their understanding of the markets they operate in is much deeper. Their need for kind of optical enhancement of their capabilities is much lower, right? The amount of money they're willing to spend discretionarily on things is much lower. But, one day I'd love to do more work in Central Asia and other places.
I'm interested in, especially at the start of London Politica, your client acquisition process. So how did you manage to get huge agents like the United Nations, the Red Cross? How were you able to do this? I know you talked about sending 500 cold emails a day, but what was the most effective form of acquiring new clients for you?
Yeah. Let me get your question as well, and I'll answer them together.
So you were talking briefly about how AI is going to take away people's I don't know how to phrase the question of what I was going to do, but basically I was wondering what do you think the future of AI is. So is it going to be I don't know, phones? Everyone has it, and it's not going to be as important as in it's going to be an everyday part, and we're going to forget about how there was a time without it. Or do you think it's going to continue? I don't know. What do you think the future is? And also, do you think that at any point in time will you were talking about investors? Will there ever be able to make it so that AI can invest in the stock market successfully, so that it's always got a profit?
You want to make money, don't you? Okay. I mean, let me answer that first, right? Which is, I think what's interesting is how AI will change hardware. So you mentioned the phone, right? What's really interesting is Johnny Ive, who designed the first iPhone, teamed up with Sam Altman and OpenAI to start what is the next hardware for OpenAI look like, right? Fundamentally, we interact with the world through our phones and through typing on it and through reading screens, right? But why does it have to be that way? How does it look completely different in 10 years? And that company raised a lot of money, and we heard nothing from them ever since, because it's a really hard question to answer, right? I think what most companies are betting on, what OpenAI is betting on, is voice as the future of interacting with AI. Is fundamentally we'll live in a social environment where we're much more used to talking to our computers than we are to sitting down and crafting long messages on them, right? And that everybody will be doing that constantly to the point that it'll blend in so seamlessly. And I kind of buy that. And the reason I buy that is because, you think 2 years ago when you'd never seen an AI-generated picture before, or if you had seen it, it looked incredibly sloppy, right? You wouldn't believe ever that it was a real picture. We have reached the point, I think, today already, that most creative work, whether it is making a song, whether it is generating a picture, a piece of art, writing a poem, writing a book, right? To even the most trained eye, there's nothing that humans can write and AI can write and generate that is, clearly different, right? They're so indistinguishable at this point. And we've become so normalized to this as a reality, right? We didn't know this 2 or 3 years ago. And so I think us interacting with voice, and I think AI becoming a part of, very everyday interactions is totally going to become normalized in the future. Will it help make money on the stock market? Well, I think it already does help make money on the stock market. If you mean using AI to pick investments, right?
Yeah.
90% of the gains of the stock market today are high frequency trading, right? Which means basically traders that design, computer algorithms that trade money on the stock market without the actual trader having any idea of what the strategy is, what the logic is, right? They trade on in milliseconds, right? So one of the most interesting things is when you have an office, let's say in Manhattan in New York, the way that those quantitative kind of AI-driven investment firms gain the most advantage partly is recruiting good people to code better AI. It's mostly in developing better fiber optic cables that carry the data from that physical office location to where the brokerage happens. And it's a difference of like 0.00005 milliseconds. And that makes all the difference. And I think AI is going to supercharge, a lot of that. So there's going to be a lot more algorithmic trading, like trading by computers that already exist today. It'll also make markets more inefficient, right? Because in a world where technology is more reactive than ever, right? In a world where, for instance, you have a press release and AI reads it and says, I think this is a bad press release, and starts selling the stock, and all the other companies start selling the stock. And let's say that press release isn't representative of the company, right? 10 years ago, that wouldn't create like a market cascade, right? Because there'd be fundamental investors who look at the fundamentals of the company and stop that. With AI, that's a lot harder to solve. And your question was, how do we get the first clients?
Yeah.
I don't know, a lot of cold emailing. The thing that worked most is, what I realized is like, these corporations seem to me as like very nebulous, large conglomerates, right? And so I thought like getting the UN as a client surely is so much hierarchy and bureaucracy and this and that. And it is, but at the same time, the only thing that works is if you find someone on the inside that is like an enlightened person that sees the need personally for what we do and will fight internally for you to make that happen. And so to this day, there's very few companies that have a corporate structure where they say like, we need geopolitical advice. And they go down their board and they make a decision and they go out and look for 6 companies and they find one of them. Usually it's one person that like wishes they studied politics in university, that follows things too closely. And so I was like, guys, we should think about this. And then they are the ones internally vouching for you. Every single client I have, there's one person like that who is our key relationship. And so the biggest thing I learned over 5 years is finding out like who that person is, identifying them, and becoming friends with them and selling to them and to their needs and not the company's needs. You're always, always, always selling to a person, right? You're never selling to whatever their company motto is, whatever, right? And understanding where they fit into the picture. Second thing I learned is I used to have a much better idea in my head of like, this is the product and this is what we're selling, and I'd sell the product. But when you're a really young company, you have to reinvent your product constantly in accordance with what your client says they want, right? They say they might want one thing, and it's probably actually your thing, but you have to talk about it in totally different language to sell it to that client. But ultimately, if your focus is on meeting their stated need, you'll go so much more of a longer way than convincing them to move even like a little bit to the right to get, what you're selling, right? In the language that you're selling it. Yeah, those are 2 things I learned.
Awesome. I think that's all we have time for this part. Thank you very much. Thank you.